Welcome back. Today we are going to review PBMs, Pharmacy Benefit Management, third-party administrators or management companies. So this is a topic that most employers are completely 100% unaware of. So we are going to go through why it's important, how it can apply to you, whether you're a big company, a small company, even individuals should probably be aware of how PBMs work. It will empower you as a consumer. So we're going to go over articles, we're going to go over visuals, we're going to look at all aspects of PBMs. So hang on tight and let's get through it. Okay, first off here. So PBMs play a crucial role in the prescription drug market, as intermediaries between the insurance companies, drug manufacturers, and pharmacies. PBMs help manage drug benefits for health plans, negotiate discounts, establish formularies, and formulary is just a fancy word for a list of drugs that the insurance company has agreed to pay and agreed to cover, and handle claims processing. They are typically chosen by entities that sponsor health plans, such as large employers or insurance companies. Those large employers, sometimes large employers will receive a renewal or a proposal from their broker, perhaps, or from their insurance company, and there will be several options that allow them to keep their current medical benefit plan design. For example, keep their $500 deductible, 80% coverage, $20 copays, and so on. But the only change when saving money perhaps is changing their network. And some insurance companies will offer alternative PBMs or different ways of managing their pharmaceutical benefits, and sometimes they give large employers that option. And there are some small employers that may have similar options as well. Now, when employers really have the keys is when they are self-funded. They have more options for choosing the PBM and making more customizations to the plan. And in these decisions and negotiations and contracts, they look at, are we getting reimbursements on any rebates that are coming in? What is the monthly cost per month per employee on these PBMs? There are several different factors to be aware of when negotiating on those plans, but we'll get to that later. They're typically chosen by entities that sponsor health plans, usually insurance companies or self-funded employers. While PBM selection is generally an option for self-funded plans, fully insured plans usually have a PBM embedded in their insurance carrier or in their insurance company policy, meaning the employer or plan sponsor may not directly choose the PBM. So there are certain situations where the employer is stuck, the insurance company that they're working with doesn't have any alternative drug lists, formularies, or even PBMs for them to choose from, and it's wrapped up into the health insurance plan. And however, don't get discouraged. It is still a good idea to understand how these things work and how PBMs work in general. So we're certainly going to go over that. So how PBMs work and their role in drug costs. So PBMs generate revenue through multiple channels, including administrative fees, rebates from drug manufacturers, and spread pricing. Spread pricing is where they may charge a higher price to the insurer or the person that's covered, the person that's getting the medication, than they pay to the pharmacy. So the PBM is the middleman that is sourcing all of the components, all of the manufacturers, all the pharmaceuticals, and managing those claims and what's covered and what's not covered. Rebates in particular are a significant component Drug manufacturers often provide rebates to PBMs to ensure their drugs are included in the PBM's formulary. So in these rebates that the pharmaceutical companies may give to PBMs are because they are incentivizing those pharmacy benefit management systems to cover their drugs, to get them on their formularies or get them on the drug lists. The PBMs may be a part of some or all of these rebates, or they may keep, yes, so the PBM may be keeping a portion of the rebates or may be rebating an employer. So, for example, with, let's say, Humira, it's a very popular, I wouldn't even say popular. For example, with Humira, it is a highly prescribed medication for people who have autoimmune conditions. And with a drug like Humira, they may give rebates to the PBM of, let's say, $1,800 per year. And many PBMs may only reimburse the insurance company or the self-funded employer, let's say $800 or $1,000, depending on the contract. So it will be a percentage of the rebate oftentimes, or a flat dollar amount for each medication they will issue rebates on to the employer. Again, do not get confused. These rebates are not coming to the consumer. These rebates are going to PBMs and insurance companies, and sometimes to employers if those employers are self-funded. PBMs may keep a part of all of these rebates. Rebates can also influence which drugs are more accessible to patients, potentially excluding lower cost alternatives like generics to maximize rebate earnings. Yes and no. It's usually that the lower the drug cost overall, they're just looking at a lower overall drug cost. And yes, they can look into whether or not they're getting a rebate on a medication? Yes. So I wouldn't say that generics are excluded in many cases. It's probably very minimal that this sort of situation would happen, but at the end of the day, it's just math. At the end of the day, what is the average annual cost to the PBM for prescription A versus prescription B versus prescription C, and so on, and which of those options are going to make the most sense financially, including rebates, again, total cost, and decisions are made based off of that. Because if you don't know, usually when you have a condition, multiple drugs can treat that condition, especially if it's not a rare condition or a brand new condition that's recently been discovered, or a brand new revolutionary sort of treatment that has just come onto the scene. So in those scenarios, patients usually have dozens of medications to choose from, and so do PBMs. So often they will narrow down their options of what they choose to cover based off of the total annual cost of each medication. PBM rebates to employers and rising costs. So self-insured employers who select their own PBMs can sometimes receive direct rebates. This setup can improve transparency and potentially reduce costs, as it allows the employer to benefit directly from rebates rather than being retained by the PBM. With increased scrutiny on PBM practices, some policymakers advocate for more transparency to ensure rebates and savings are passed to employers and ultimately to consumers. So absolutely, completely 100% agree with any and all transparency, especially when the PBM is managing someone else's money. In general, that is what they are doing in most cases. Either they're choosing what to spend money on as far as insurance companies are concerned, and certainly for employers. So if a company is spending someone else's money and authorizing someone else to use money from an account that is owned by an employer, I believe it is 100% reasonable to push for transparency. So we're going to look at trends in drug costs over time. Drug costs have significantly increased over the past several decades, outpacing general inflation for sure. For instance, over the last 50 years, prescription drugs have grown to comprise a much larger share of healthcare spending. So when we're looking at the total cost of a health plan and we look at a pie chart, we'll see that the percentage of that pie chart of the total costs are growing and growing and growing. This has been driven particularly by the structure and operations of PBMs, potentially. Data from recent reports revealed that pharmacy-related costs can now account for up to 20 to 30% of total healthcare plan costs, a significant jump from the past. This increase is often attributed to a combination of rising drug prices, PBM practices, and growing prevalence of expensive specialty drugs. So, in my opinion, it has most to do with the rising cost of drugs and specialty medications and practices that are really being rough on smaller compound pharmacies that are providing some alternative medicines for people. It is extremely rough for these smaller compound pharmacies to do business, and more legislation and more regulation is making it more and more expensive to create drugs independently outside of a very large pharmaceutical company. And again, we look at the market. So if we have a healthy market of true competition, we will see more competitive pricing. So unfortunately, over the years, we have seen consolidation in the areas of even generic drugs, and particularly in specialty medications and injectable medications. The bigger pharmaceutical companies want to push big brand name drugs as opposed to allowing people to use compound pharmacies. Of course, there needs to be education for people as far as what they're getting with a compound pharmacy. They may be getting more of a generic version of the medication, but compound pharmacies can do quite a bit when they have the right ingredients. At the end of the day, a drug is a chemistry of different compounds, almost like cooking. If you have the flour and you have the eggs and you have the sugar, you can really make several different things depending on the ratios that you put into the batter or into the recipe. And similarly with compound drug manufacturers or these smaller compound pharmacies, they do have several types of chemistries and recipes, if you will. They can put several different recipes together. However, as these pharmaceutical manufacturers get larger and larger and pay more towards lobbying politically and really having all the money in the world to put out negative press on compound pharmacies, it really is a David and Goliath type of story where the small guy is really trying to run a business and create a good product in many cases. Of course, there's always bad apples. I mean, I've heard of several horror stories where compound pharmacies were stating they were producing a medication that they were not, and filing claims with insurance companies and basically committing insurance fraud. And in those cases, those people should be brought to justice, certainly. However, for those that are really doing honest work, making their businesses more difficult is going to reduce competition in the marketplace, or also limiting what they can do and what chemicals and what compounds they can work with within a compound pharmacy will limit competition with the big guys. And at some point, something has to break. More and more medications are being brought to the market, and pharmaceutical drug companies have gained more and more power over the years, and that is something to consider and something to look at. This increase is often attributed to a combination of rising drug prices, PBM practices, and the growing prevalence of expensive specialty drugs. For a more visual and statistical breakdown of drug cost increases and the impact on overall healthcare spending, resources like Drug Channels Institute annual report provides charts and data. The Federal Trade Commission also offers insights into how PBMs impact drug accessibility and costs, with recent reports that include visuals detailing PBM practices and the rising costs associated with prescription drug. Federal Trade Commission and two Federal Trade Commission articles. So let's look into those. Okay. And here is a figure. This is from the FTC. So this is the Federal Trade Commission, and the report is called the Pharmacy Benefit Managers, the Powerful Middlemen Inflating Drug Costs and Squeezing Main Street Pharmacies. And this is interesting because it gives the scope of increasing costs. So this graph shows since 2016, and of course this chart is in the billions. It was about 400 billion in 2016, not even 10 years ago. And that was very similar in 2017. And then 2018, it ticked up to 411 billion, then 429 billion, and then 450 billion, 484 billion, and in 2022 it jumped up to 535 billion, and in 2023 it's at 600 billion. So quite the graph there showing the rising costs of pharmaceuticals. In addition, it shows exactly where the costs are. So pretty consistently, retail is about 50 to 60%. In the past, it has been closer to 60%. So retail would be you walking into a pharmacy or going to a drive-up window and picking up your prescription from a Walgreens, a Rite Aid, CVS, and so on. And then traditional mail order. So traditional mail order would be if you're on a management medication, so a medication that you are taking on a monthly basis. And many insurance companies will give you a discount for setting up a mail order pharmacy with them. So let's say that your prescription is a $20 copay every month. So over a 3-month period, that would be $60. Many insurance companies say, hey, if you set your prescription, your maintenance medication up with us, we will send you a 3-month supply for 2 copays. So you would pay $40 instead of the $60. And that is traditional mail order, usually pills. And then you have specialty retail. So this is getting a prescription of a specialty medication, usually an injectable, from a retail pharmacy. And then specialty mail order would be they are mailing it to your house. And as you can see, that has jumped from about 20% all the way up to about 31% there in the total cost of the pie of that $600 billion industry. And here we have, I thought I should show you this figure. It's figure 18, a sample of drug type and costs associated with formulary tiers. So in this report, they refer to several different tiers, and I have already glossed over this very important point, and I apologize. There are different tiers within your pharmacy drug plan, and you usually, or it used to be, and it depends on what plan you have, it used to be generic, brand, and non-formulary. Those were the typical 3-tiered prescription drug plan, and prescription drug plans have gotten a lot more complicated, especially in the last 10 years. And here they're displaying 5 different tiers. Tier 1 is typically preferred generic drugs, and preferred generic drugs are the drugs that are on the market that insurance companies or PBMs have determined to be the lowest cost on the market. And that is because about 15 years ago, there were a lot of acquisitions of generic drug manufacturers who held patents, exclusive patents with that were FDA approved. And those drug manufacturers then increased the rate of those generic drugs, increased the cost to the consumer. They said, hey, this prescription costs $50 a month that this company is currently charging. They're the only one that's FDA approved, therefore they're the only generic of this type that can be sold in the US. So with the traditional economic rule of supply and demand, therefore we can charge basically whatever the market will bear, right? So they then decided to increase the cost to the consumer hundreds of percentages. And I am going to show an article in which this is the exact example of when this started happening. And so when that happened, the reaction from the insurance company marketplace was to create more tiers. So instead of having a simple tier just called generic drugs, now we have tier 1 and tier 2 in many cases. And people like me then have to go and explain to the employees and to HR people and other insurance professionals that no, tier 1 is not necessarily generic anymore, it's preferred generic. Tier 2 can also be generics. Sometimes it's lower cost brand name drugs, but it's usually the higher cost generics that got manipulated in the market for being the exclusive manufacturer to these FDA approvals. And tier 3 are preferred brand name drugs, the brand name drugs that tend to be less expensive than other brand name drugs. And tier 4 are non-preferred. These are usually the drugs that are brand new to the market, again, that have exclusivity with approval on the FDA for these specific treatments or these specific types of drugs, and therefore they can charge more money and they are more expensive. Then we've got tier 5, which are specialty medications. These are also usually brand name drugs and they are injectables. And here we have an article on a recent report, one of which I just went over some figures. And this article is a result of that report, is titled FTC Issues Interim Report on Pharmacy Benefit Managers. And in this report, you'll see a visual that goes over how these pharmacy benefit managers are structured. I'm sure if you have a healthcare plan and you've ever had a specialty medication delivered to your house or mail order pharmacy, you have seen some of these names. We've got CVS, Caremark, Express Scripts, Optum RX, Humana, Med Impact, and Prime are the 5 top ones, and it shows who the pharmacy is for specialty, who the pharmacy is for mail order, and which health plan it's associated with. So with Aetna owns basically the parent or the owner is CVS Health Corporation, and the health issuer is Aetna. Cigna Group is for obviously Cigna, and they own Express Scripts. And we've got United Healthcare owning Optum, of course, and the insurance issuer is United Healthcare. Humana owns Humana Pharmacy Solutions, and that is the health issuer, the insurance company that issues health insurance plans. Then we've got MedImpact Holdings, Inc. It is a standalone PBM, and Prime, it does not give us, so that's owned by Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. That's Prime, and it's 19 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. So Blue Cross Blue Shield is pretty special in that they're divided up into several different companies across the United States. So that one varies quite significantly depending on your state. So that's just a brief overview there. And then this article talks about this study that came out and some of the conclusions that are being drawn as a result of this study. So let's get into it. The Federal Trade Commission recently released an interim staff report detailing its findings on the role and impact of PBMs within the U.S. prescription drug market. This report, part of an ongoing investigation, aims to shed light on the business practices of PBMs and their effects on drug prices, competition, and consumer access to medications. PBMs act as intermediaries between insurance companies, pharmacy, and drug manufacturers. They are responsible for negotiating discounts, managing drug formularies, and processing prescription drug claims. PBMs are intended to control costs and ensure patients' access to necessary medications. However, the FTC's report highlights several concerns about the opaque and potentially anti-competitive practices of PBMs. The report found that PBMs can have great power over patients' ability to access and afford prescription drugs. This can allow PBMs great influence to determine which drugs are available and at what price. The FTC's interim report lays out how dominant pharmacy benefit managers can hike the cost of drugs, including overcharging patients for cancer drugs, said the FTC chair, Lena M. Khan. The report also details how PBMs can squeeze independent pharmacies that many Americans, especially those in rural communities, depend on for essential care. The FTC will continue to use all of our tools and authorities to scrutinize dominant players across healthcare markets and ensure that Americans can access affordable healthcare. Key findings. Key findings from the FTC report: the lack of transparency and opaque practice structures. One of the primary concerns raised in the report is the lack of transparency in PBM operations. The FTC found that PBMs often use complex and opaque pricing structures, making it difficult for stakeholders to understand the true cost of the prescription drugs. This lack of clarity can lead to higher out-of-pocket costs for consumers and increased expenses for healthcare providers and insurers. Rebates and fees. The report highlights the role of rebates and fees in the PBM business model. PBMs negotiate rebates from drug manufacturers in exchange for including their products on formularies. However, the report suggests that these rebates may not always be passed on to consumers or insurers. Instead, PBMs may retain a significant portion of these rebates, which can distort drug pricing and limit competition. Formulary management and drug access. PBMs have significant control over which drugs are covered by insurance plans through their formulary management practices. The FTC found that PBMs may prioritize drugs that offer higher rebates over those that are more cost-effective or clinically appropriate. This can limit patients' access to necessary medications and drive up healthcare costs. Vertical integration and market power. The FTC report also addresses the issue of consolidation and vertical integration of the PBM industry, basically illustrated by the graph shown at the beginning of this article. The vertical integration can lead to conflicts of interest and anti-competitive behavior, as PBMs may favor their own affiliated entities over independent competitors. I agree and disagree. The part I disagree with is that because insurance is so highly regulated and the profits of the insurance companies are regulated more so after ACA or Obamacare, because it is all under one umbrella. It's all considered in the total overall cost of the health plan, versus if they did have separate entities, that may look actually more shady if an insurance company had well, maybe that's what they're saying then, because if this insurance company is, if you have, for example, let's look at United Healthcare, and United Healthcare has Optum Health, and Optum Health is running at a 20% profit margin, and United Healthcare is then paying that PBM, and they are saying, hey, we pay this PBM and this is our cost of medication. And they just include that in the report to the government to show their 3.5% profit margin to be in alignment with ACA, right? And then, but on the other side, they have co-ownership, so the owners are benefiting in some way. Because they are separate companies, maybe that's kind of what they're alluding to. For instance, but here, because the parent and the owner is United Healthcare, I would think that because the owner is United Healthcare, they would have to break out those individual costs, and they couldn't just pay Optum. And you'll see that with all of these except for the Aetna one. The Aetna one is the only one that's structured in the way I just described. Again, I'd have to look at all of I'm not a forensic audit person, but I would think that somebody would have to look at what they're reporting to the government as far as their profitability margins on ACA compliant health plans, and if those are in alignment. Obviously they are in alignment, otherwise they wouldn't be able to sell the plans. And then what the profitability is on the separate PBM, the CVS Health Corporation. And if somehow they're making a higher profit on the CVS Health Corporation versus obviously Aetna. So let's say they're making 20% on the CVS Health Corporation, the PBM, but they're only, showing that tight margin on the ACH health plans. So that's how I could see it there. More so, but again, I'm not a forensic auditor, so that's for someone else, but it seems like they're investigating it. And we were looking at the vertical integration. The report notes that the top 3 PBMs processed more than 75% of the roughly 6.6 billion prescriptions dispensed by pharmacies in the United States in 2023, with top 6 PBMs processing more than 90% of the prescriptions. Okay, so impact on independent pharmacies. Independent pharmacies have long argued that PBMs use their market power to impose unfair terms and reimbursement rates. The FTC's report supports these claims, finding PBMs often steer patients to their affiliated pharmacies and reimburse independent pharmacies at rates that are unsustainable, forcing many to close or consolidate. This reduction in competition can negatively impact consumer access to pharmacy services, particularly in rural and underserved areas. These practices have allowed pharmacies affiliated with top 3 largest PBMs to have high levels of dispensing revenue and excess of their estimated drug acquisition costs, including almost $1.6 billion in excess revenue on 2 cancer drugs in less than 3 years. Yes, I completely agree. And we've seen this just in our lifetimes, seeing these small mom and pop pharmacies close up shop and be integrated into the Rite Aids, the CVS's, Walgreens, Walmarts, and so on. Spread pricing. Another practice scrutinized in the report is spread pricing, where PBMs charge insurers and payers more for prescription drugs than they reimburse the pharmacy, pocketing the difference. This practice can inflate costs for insurers and ultimately for consumers without providing any additional value to the healthcare system. And pricing structures to insurers, pharmacies, and regulators, greater transparency would allow stakeholders to make more informed decisions and ensure that savings are passed on to the consumer. Regulation of rebate practices. The report recommends visiting the role of rebates in PBM business model. Policymakers would consider measures to ensure that rebates are fully passed on to the insurers and consumers rather than being retained by the PBMs. This could help us align incentives and reduce the distortion of drug pricing. So I do agree with this, especially from an accounting perspective. Again, I'm not an accountant. However, when I have looked at PBMs and prescription drug costs, it can be extremely messy. It takes an extra step to figure out, several steps in some cases, and time. So you have to remember that these reimbursements don't come right away. It's not like the prescription drug gets filled and then the reimbursement check is in the mail the next month. It's really often a year after that prescription has been filled, and a lot of times they want to see that prescription used over a certain number of months before they're even qualified to receive the reimbursement. So many of these PBMs don't like to include those numbers, especially upfront, because they haven't gotten the money yet. And so I see certainly that side of it, but from an accounting perspective and trying to understand the costs, just being black and white about what the costs are and bringing it all into just a general monthly cost when that prescription is purchased and picked up would certainly help and make everyone's job a lot easier. Promoting competition and fair reimbursement. To address the impact on independent pharmacies and competition, the FTC suggests exploring policies that promote fair reimbursement rates and prevent anti-competitive practices. This could include measures to limit spread pricing and ensure that reimbursement rates reflect the true cost of dispensing medications. Oversight and vertical integration. The FTC also highlights the need for greater oversight of vertical integration in the PBM industry. This could involve scrutinizing mergers and acquisitions more closely to prevent excessive consolidation of market power. Additionally, policies could be implemented to ensure that PBMs operate independently of their affiliated entities, reducing conflicts of interest. Okay, like I said, when looking at the total cost and the total profitability of one said company, I feel like if there's shared ownership amongst the PBMs and they're two separate companies, then some profitability can be hidden in the PBMs versus if they're all in one. If the insurance company just is the PBM and they have a department that is the PBM, I feel like that would be more transparent than having these separate companies and potentially, if they do have different ownership and how that ownership is passed through and who it goes to. I mean, figuring all that stuff out would be a lot harder, I would think. Again, I'm not a, forensic accountant, but I think it would make it more messy. Conclusion of next steps. The FTC's interim report provides a comprehensive overview of the current state of the PBM industry and its impacts. As the FTC's investigation to PBMs is ongoing, further reports and recommendations are expected. Stakeholders, including policymakers, healthcare providers, insurers, and consumers, will need to stay informed about the progress of this investigation and potential regulatory changes that may arise. So now we're going to move on to pharmaceuticals, the cost of pharmaceuticals, and look at how generic drugs are impacting the market. So traditionally, generic drugs, the more generic drugs you have on a plan, the better the cost is. So traditionally, the idea has been to push consumers to try generic versions first, and then if that doesn't work, move them on to a brand name medication. However, it's gotten a lot more complicated over the years, so let's look at what's going on in the market today. So pharmaceutical companies in some cases purchased the rights to generic drug patents and subsequently raised prices, leveraging their market position when there are limited or no alternatives approved by the FDA. This practice often involves securing patents for drugs that have little competition and sometimes acquiring secondary patents to extend exclusivity and delay the entry of additional generics. So it takes several years for a prescription to get FDA approval. So they know that when they purchase a company that is a generic that has exclusive rights to sell that drug in the United States via the FDA, and they can look and see who is on the docket for getting approved. If there's no one on the docket, they know they have years of exclusivity on that drug. So they purchase the drug as a business decision and then subsequently raise the prices. For example, in recent years, cases have emerged where companies raise prices for generic drugs by staggering percentages after securing exclusive rights. A notable instance involves the drug Diaprim. I want to say Diaprim, but it says Diaprim, whose price infamously surged over 5,000% after Turning Pharmaceuticals, the name of the company that bought this particular medication was Turning Pharmaceuticals under CEO Mark Schrekerli, Schreili, acquired it, and I remember this. More recently, companies have used similar tactics by obtaining FDA-approved generics, limiting competition, and then raising prices. This strategy of acquiring and extending patents has been referred to as patent thickets or engaging in pay-for-delay agreements. In these cases, brand name manufacturers reach agreements with potential generic competitors to delay the introduction of cheaper versions. As a result, companies can maintain higher prices for extended periods by limiting competitive pressure. Such tactics have been linked to significant price increases over time, sometimes upwards of 300% to 400%, impacting the affordability of essential medication. Yes, I would say that on average, that's what we saw. I want to say it was about 15 years ago. This first incident came out, and it was all over the headlines of this Daraprim and this Turning Pharmaceuticals. They were like a venture capital firm that was just going around and buying all of these FDA-approved generic medications, and most of them went up 300 to 400%. I'm not saying they were the only ones, but they, again, because it was the most egregious. And I know that he did get investigated. There was a lot of federal scrutiny after that. I'm not 100% sure what happened with that case, but we'll just keep reading here. The impact of these practices is evident in the broader drug pricing trends over the past few decades. According to the FDA and various studies, the cost of generics, while generally lower than brand name drugs, can become inflated when market competition is restricted. The Regulatory Review and Richmond Journal of Law and Technology highlights that these practices as significant contributors to raising costs and reduce access to affordable medications. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some of these articles. So here we've got the U.S. Food and Drug Administration article, Generic Competition and Drug Prices. So how generic advances public health by improving access to affordable medication. Access to affordable medicines remains a significant public health priority to the FDA. Below is a list of our most recent studies. FDA will publish new analysis here as they are completed. So estimated cost savings from new generic drug approvals. So again, you have to remember that the FDA is trying to save face with all of this scrutiny that's buzzing around over the years. Scrutiny has increased. So here they're showing, that they are earning their keep, for lack of a better term. And here's a graph that says estimated savings from generic drug approvals, savings based on sales during 12 months following approvals. So year of ANDA's approvals here. Study estimates savings from 742 generic drug applications fully approved by the FDA in 2022. This work is a continuation of previous research using similar methods on estimating savings from generic drug approvals in earlier years, all of which show the relationship between generic competitors and drug prices, with market entry of just a few generic competitors yielding generic prices below the brand name prices in September of 2024. And overall, we did see that graph I first showed you that showed just a couple years ago that the pharmaceutical market was estimated to be 400 billion, and today it's 600 billion. I believe that went back to 2016. Here we're looking at 2018. And again, not 100% sure on what the blue represents versus the dark blue. There's no key. So maybe I'm just a Luddite here, but I believe that this is an unclear report. So here it's saying the full bar is the total savings, and then first generic savings is the darker area. Yes, I had to go and take a break. I am look a little different than I did when I started this project. But here I'm picking up where I left off, which was estimated savings from generic drug approvals, savings based on sales over 12 months following approvals. So this here shows the graph. I was a little bit confused when I first looked at this because there's no key. So it appears that the darker top half is first generic savings. So for example, in 2022, it was 5.2 billion, and then total savings are estimating at 18.9 billion, and in 2020 it was 1.8 billion, and the total estimated savings was 10.7. So these are generic drugs approved in 2022, and this is they are estimating the savings. So it's saying variations in savings over time are largely associated with the mix of products for which generics are approved for each year. For example, high-priced, large market products tend to yield more savings when new generics enter the market compared to products serving smaller markets. So they're taking the cost of what the brand name drugs are and that they're approving generics for and subtracting that from the estimated cost of the generic. Not sure how accurate that is. I'm sure that the generic manufacturer then has to give an estimated price. I don't know how strict they are about making sure that the price that they're estimating that is going to go to market is held up to, but that sounds like that's what they're doing in these estimations. All right, so that is from the FDA, and then we're going to move on to this article. So we got a government source, and here we're looking at an example from October 16th, 2023 on how patents contribute to high drug prices. So this is from the Regulatory Review, and it is by Laura Dolbo. In August, the White House announced a list of 10 drugs selected for the first round of Medicare negotiation pricing. The pharmaceutical industry has been quick to challenge the new program, describing it as a taking of their patented medicines. What pharmaceutical companies have been less quick to do, however, is describe what the patent protections on their drugs actually look like and how they are using those patent protections in practice. The drugs selected for Medicare price negotiations provided case study shows how pharmaceutical companies have used the patent system to delay generic competition and to charge high prices. Each selected drug currently does not face bona fide generic competition, in large part due to patents that cover the drugs. Seven of the 10 selected drugs are small molecule drugs, which means they have relatively simple chemical structures. These 7 drugs are Eliquis, Jardiance, Xarelto, Januvia, Farxiga, Entresto, and Imbruvica. Patents covering these drugs products are publicly listed in the Orange Book, which identifies drug products approved on the basis of safety and effectiveness by the USDA under the procedures set up by Watch-Mexman Act. Patents listed in the Orange Book delay FDA approval of generic versions of the drugs. The patents listed on the 7 selected drugs reveal 2 common themes. First, each selected drug claims protection from multiple patents that expire at different times. Drug manufacturers often obtain numerous patents on secondary aspects of drug production, such as formulation of a capsule containing the active ingredient or a method of treating a disease at a specific dosage. These secondary patents often expire years after the patents on the active pharmaceutical ingredient expires. Okay, so that's interesting. I didn't know that. Not only do they have a patent on the prescription drug, they then have additional patents that are filed years later on alternative uses or different ways of distributing or getting the medication in a generic version. So they're basically protecting their patent in these different ways to make it harder to get a generic version. According to the Evergreen Drug Patent Database provided by the University of California College of the Law, most of the selected drugs listed between 3 to 6 unique patents in the Orange Book. 2 selected drugs stand out for even higher numbers of patents: Farxiga and Imbruvica. Companies listed 36 unique patents covering Farxiga and 27 unique patents covering Imbruvica. These secondary patents extend the overall patent protection period for these drugs. For example, the patent on the compound used in Farxiga, dapagliflozin, expires on October 4th, 2025. Another listed patent on the method of treating heart disease with dapagliflozin. Dapagliflozin does not expire until 14 years and 5 months later on March 9th, 2040. Second, manufacturers listed patents for each of the selected drugs in the Orange Book after the product initially obtained FDA approval. Manufacturers listed new patents for each of the selected drugs at least 3 years after the product first obtained FDA approval. New patent was listed for Imbruvica, for example, just a few months ago, over 9 years after Imbruvica was first approved. So again, delaying the ability to create a generic for another 9 years. Whether the current legal landscape for pharmaceutical patents is a good policy is a hostily debated topic, I can imagine. Yet one thing is certain, patents are a key reason why drug prices are so high. Patents, along with regulatory exclusivities, allow manufacturers to delay entry of generic competitors in the market even after FDA has tentatively approved generics. Tentative approval means that the FDA has concluded that the generic drug product is ready for approval, but patent or exclusivity issues have not yet been resolved. For 6 of the selected small molecule drugs, the FDA has tentatively approved at least one generic version. In most of these cases, the FDA tentatively approved generic versions years ago. For example, the FDA tentatively approved a generic version for Eliquis in December 2018, and it tentatively approved a generic version of Januvia in October 2012. Moreover, for most of these 6 drugs with generic versions approved, the FDA tentatively approved more than one generic version of each. At least 10 manufacturers have received tentative approval for generic versions of the Eliquis, as well as Jardiance, Januvia, and Farxiga. And although the generic versions of Entresto has yet to be tentatively approved, at least 18 manufacturers have filed applications for FDA approval. When drug manufacturers use patents to delay generic competition, they retain considerable power to charge higher prices for their products. I would also argue that, or I would say that these generic drug manufacturers now have to charge more because they've been waiting in the wings and running operations in hopes of getting these generics approved, and I'm sure they have investors that are investing money and just holding out and waiting for these approvals. The Inflation Reduction Act allows price negotiation only for qualified single-source drugs, which are drugs that do not face bona fide generic competition. For small molecule drugs, the law only allows price negotiation for drugs that have been single-source drugs for at least 7 years. So I'm not a pharmacist, I don't know anything about the chemistry, but I always wonder about the small compound pharmacies. I'm more of a person that likes the idea of decentralizing things and creating more competition to reduce costs and giving power to the smaller companies and to the individuals. And one way to do that is decentralizing. So right now we have a very centralized system of these huge companies controlling all these drugs. If it's a small molecule drug, is this something that the compound pharmacies can create? As long as they have that molecule, they can just put it into a medication. It might have to be an injectable, or maybe these other ones are pills, and of course, I'm sure there's different mechanisms of action. Some things can be taken digestively and some can be injected, and sometimes it doesn't work that way. Your body, with some drugs, they have to be injected, and other drugs has to be taken orally. And I do slightly understand some of that. However, if there's a way to give this back to smaller manufacturers, and I would think that the smallest manufacturer would be a compound pharmacy, and making the molecule generic in general so that more people can have access to it and create medications for people. Not sure if that's something that is even possible with all these regulations, or maybe it was something that was possible in the past and isn't anymore, but just a thought. It is not surprising then that drugs recently selected by the Biden administration for price negotiation are covered by numerous patents. By targeting drugs that do not face bona fide competition, the Medicare price negotiation program shines a light on how pharmaceutical patents in practice contribute. Sheds light on how pharmaceutical patents in practice contribute to high drug prices, both for consumers and the government. Okay, then we get into, so this one is the Richmond Journal of Law and Technology, Patents over Patients, How Pharmaceutical Companies Use Patent System to Keep Drug Costs High, by Caitlin Carroll. This is another article, but it has lots of examples of how patients are getting, the United States is in a drug pricing crisis. Absolutely. 1 in 4 Americans report they simply cannot afford to take their medications as prescribed. Part of what has led to the crisis is the pharmaceutical industry's manipulation of the patent system, which we just went over. Once generic brands enter the market, drug prices drop by up to 90%. However, drug manufacturers have been manipulating the patent system to extend their monopolies for years, namely through the use of patent thickets and pay for delay agreements. We went over that pretty extensively in the last article, so here is an example. So it goes on to say that one way that pharmaceutical companies extend their monopolies is by building up patent thickets by stacking multiple patents covering the same product. Pharmaceutical companies strategically overlap slightly different patent protection periods and can ensure the drug's monopoly for decades past the original patent expiration. More than half of the top 12 selling drugs in the US have over 100 attempted patents per drug. For each of these top 12 drugs, there are at least 38 years of attempting patent protection sought by drug makers, almost double the intended 20-year period. Of these top-selling drugs, the number one spot goes to Humira, a rheumatoid arthritis medication sold by AbbVie. Although the initial patent on Humira expired in 2016, thanks to the over 75 patents filed 3 years before its expiration, AbbVie is set to hold the monopoly until 2034. With this monopoly, AbbVie is able to hold prices high enough to keep medication out of reach for many Americans. A coalition of ethical investors is now questioning several pharmaceutical companies' tactics, including AbbVie, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. The coalition is demanding accountability from these corporations and answers about how these strategies are impacting patent access to medications, or patients' access to medications. Another tactic employed by pharmaceutical companies, often in conjunction with patent thickets, are pay-for-delay agreements made with generic manufacturers. Pay-for-delay agreements are created when companies who hold blockbuster drug patents, drugs with profits in the billions, pay other companies to stop them from creating cheaper generic alternatives for a certain amount of time. Companies accomplish this by first suing generic manufacturing companies for patent infringement and then settling the lawsuit by paying them to stay out of the market in what is known as a reverse payment settlement. So an example of this is seen in a 2014 deal struck by Gilead Sciences, the leading marketer of antiretrovirals used to treat HIV and AIDS. Gilead began suing Teva Pharmaceuticals, an Israeli drug company, after Teva indicated that they would be entering the market of one of Gilead's top antiretrovirals, Truvada, top antiretrovirals by the name of Truvada. The lawsuit ended in a settlement with Gilead agreeing to pay Teva, the supposed infringer, $1.5 billion in exchange for Teva delaying its entry into the Truvada market for 5 years. So they paid them out $1.5 billion in exchange for them delaying entry into the market for 5 years. Normally, when a company is sued for infringement, they are the ones that end up paying. However, for drug companies like Gilead, it can often be cheaper to threaten rivals with a lawsuit and then pay them to back off instead of actually competing with their price in the market. Brand name HIV treatments like Gilead can start at $30,000 per year per patient. To both companies engaging in a pay for delay agreement, it can seem like a win-win, but the ones really paying the price is the patients struggling to afford their medications. In 2019, a group of HIV and AIDS advocates filed a lawsuit against Gilead, arguing that this deal was a clear violation of antitrust law and an illegal effort to extend the life of their patent, which has led to a public health crisis. This gross over-profiteering explains why less than half of the people living with HIV in the United States are virally let's see. So at first glance, one would think this would be an open shut case of collusion, since the Sherman Act, the federal antitrust law statute, clearly outlaws agreements between rivals not to compete. However, due to a 2013 Supreme Court decision in the Federal Trade Commission versus activists, pay for delay agreements are no longer per se illegal, but subject to the rule of reason standard, which considers whether the collusion actually harms the consumer, and if it does, whether the business had good reason for it. The activist decision provides plenty of wiggle room for defendants to argue their way out of collusion charges using speculative business theory. Under this reason, the court found that Gilead's 2014 patent deal with Teva did not violate antitrust laws. This decision lets corporations know that these types of collusive agreements will be held up in court as long as they can argue around it, thereby assuring the continuance of these patent deals, delaying generic drug alternatives for years to come. Americans should not have to risk going into extreme debt in order to give themselves and their family members life-saving medications, and so on. Okay, then we get into this other article here. So I think it's pretty clear that pharmaceutical companies have figured out all of the regulations and laws on the books that can help them keep the monopoly on their patents as long as possible and longer than originally intended by the original set of laws written. And also, they are continuing to use the legal system to delay others from competing with them in the market, again, against the original intent of these laws. And these people that have been activists and working really hard to make sure that these drugs get on the market and are more competitive and cost less to the consumer are still being tied up in court, and attorneys have wiggled their way around these. and precedents have been set. So here we go into the final article for today. Okay, now we get into the final article of today, which talks more about regulatory exclusivities. And this next article is from U.S. Pharmacists, a pharmacist resource for clinical excellence. This article is entitled Patent and Regulatory Exclusivities, the two key driving generic and follow-on market availability. And read this. So here we go. The abstract of this is called "In order to help balance innovation in the pharmaceutical industry with affordable and equitable access to medications, the FDA has typically relied on two key systems: intellectual property or patents, and regulatory or market exclusivity. Although the two systems may seem interchangeable, they are distinct entities rooted in different policies and legislation. As the development of biologic products increases, however, the interplay between these two as the development of biologic products increases, however, the interplay between these two exclusivities may be at risk. A recent federal appeals court decision has upended the previously well choreographed exchange between brand and generic manufacturers. Although two federal legislative bills attempted to rectify some of these holes, they failed to address the gap in the patient dispute process for biologics created by the controversial Amgen versus Sandoz case. The FDA has long been tasked with balancing innovation in the pharmaceutical industry with affordable and equitable access to medications. To ensure that this balance is maintained, the FDA typically controls the market of brand and generic products through two systems: intellectual property exclusivity and regulatory exclusivity. Intellectual property exclusivity takes the form of a patent by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, whereas regulatory exclusivity, also known as market exclusivity, data exclusivity, or protection, is at the sole discretion of the FDA. To bring a generic product to market, a manufacturer must either challenge or wait out both of these exclusivities. Today, most disputes around patient and regulatory exclusivities proceed with a high level of transparency around relevant patents, largely because of the Orange Book. Over the past few decades, legislation and regulations surrounding generic products have transformed how a brand-dominant market translates to a generic-dominant market. Although the Hatch-Waxman Act eased the approval process for generics, there was a necessary shift in focus towards regulatory exclusivity in the following decades. This shift has created the need for a balancing act, a kind of dance between generic and brand manufacturers with regard to two key exclusivities. In the biologics market, however, the exact interplay between first to market and follow-on or generic has been shaky at best. For instance, the first follow-on biologic product, Zario, skipped over patent dispute process called the Patent Dance, built into Biologics Practice Competition and Innovation Act. In this pursuant legal case, Sandoz argued that the patent dispute process was not mandated by the plain language. Although the legislation distinctly described the meticulous steps by both parties in the patent dispute should take, The Federal Appeals Court sided with Sandoz and found that this process was not compensatory. This article will review high-level details about the two differences between patent and regulatory exclusivities, after which the evolution of these exclusivities as related to the increasing development of biologic products, which will be discussed. Finally, some legislative proposals that are pending in Congress at the time of this article will be highlighted. Okay. The FDA awards regulatory exclusivity to manufacturers of first-to-market brand products and excludes their manufacturers from the market. The time period differs depending on the table below on whether drug products falls into one or more types of regulatory exclusivity. So here's this graph about regulatory exclusivity. Transitional is 2 to 10 years, orphan drug is 7 years, new chemical entry 5 years, and so on. With biologics, biologics refer to a class of drug products derived from living organisms, such as a virus, a serum, a toxin, antitoxin, vaccine, blood component, allergenic product, and it goes on, or cure a disease or condition of human beings. Okay, so in short, biologics refer to drugs that are derived from living organisms. Although follow-on biologics are alternatives to first-market brand products, they are not true generics. In contrast to small molecule drugs, achieving an exact replication that would yield an interchangeable product is difficult, perhaps even insurmountable. For intellectual property, legal, and chemical reasons. In short, follow-on manufacturers no longer have access to the patents necessary to develop an exact copy of the first-to-market biologic, which usually relies on complex primary, secondary, and tertiary structure nuances to give the product its specific therapeutic and pharmacokinetic properties. So, what it sounds like is that these biologics, the actual item itself, the biologic itself, is patented, not necessarily as a brand name drug. Of course, the brand name drug is patented, and that has a exclusivity. However, there's a patent to make that patent. There's a patent to make that drug. And how can a alternative manufacturer come in and use a patented ingredient if that ingredient is patented and sold by the people that are making the medication? So if I am pharmaceutical company B and I want to come in and recreate what pharmaceutical company A has created, but pharmaceutical company A controls the patent on the materials that I need to make the drug, I can try to make something similar. I can try to make something similar by trying to replicate what ingredients they're using. But if the ingredients they're using are patented and controlled, and there's no way to really replicate it because it's based off of a living thing, a living organism, of which there's only one of that type, how do you do that? So my layman's brain is interpreting this in that way. So it is being recognized that this challenge by categorizing alternative biologics as either follow-on or interchangeable, an interchangeable designation reflects a higher level of exactness and replication with no clinically meaningful differences in terms of safety, purity, and potency, whereas a follow-on product is highly similar to and follows the same mechanism of action as the reference product. There are 3 relevant regulatory exclusivity provisions that apply only to biologics. First, branded products are given 4 years exclusivity, preventing other manufacturers from applying for FDA marketing consensuses. This also prevents other manufacturers from viewing the data contained in the brand biologic manufacturer's initial application. Second, branded products are also given a 12-year marketing exclusivity, which effectively prevents the licensing of any follow-on products for 12 years. Lastly, orphan drug exclusivity, which extends drug marketing for 7 years, runs concurrently with this 12-year biologic exclusivity. So if a biologic is also an orphan drug, the exclusivity period is 12 years, not 19. Okay. So it runs alongside of it rather than stacking on top of it. So this table 2, regulatory exclusivity provisions for biologics. So brand exclusivity 4 years and brand exclusivity against follow-on biologics is 12. So it's longer than the standard table. So in the Amgen versus Sandoz case, in this case, Sandoz, a follow-on manufacturer, forewent this process in order to avoid the exchange and instead to accept a patent dispute action by Amgen, a brand pharmaceutical brand manufacturer. The case went to federal appeals court, where it was decided by a slim margin that, one, the patent dance was compulsory if the follow-on manufacturer was willing to accept patent infringement action immediately, and 2, the brand manufacturer was entitled to an automatic 180-day preliminary injunction preventing the follow-on manufacturer from marketing its products for 180 days. In the wake of this decision, follow-on manufacturers have little incentive to participate in the patent dance. The court effectively interpreted the regulation as stating that there were 2 regulatory pathways. Although the patent dance would save some time, i.e. 180-day delay to the market, not being required to hand over proprietary information likely is appealing enough to keep some follow-on manufacturers from participating. Okay, so they're like, why would we participate if we have to share all this information when we can just wait the 180 days? Okay. So we could go on and on about the pharmaceutical company, and I'll probably bring up future articles on this topic. It is extremely complex and dense. It not only has to do with science and building a product around science and scientific study and proving that a medication actually works. It then gets into the legal system and, of course, government system of regulatory approval and publicly traded. And then you get into the layer of financing all of this, publicly traded companies and investors, and it is, again, extremely complicated industry and a very large industry, as we saw in some of the first articles. So I certainly keep an eye on all of these pharmaceutical angles, and it is a huge driver in healthcare costs here in the United States. So again, I'll keep an eye out for any new articles and regulation that comes out around prescription drug pricing. Hopefully you found that useful in this deep dive into the pharmaceutical industry and PBMs. Okay, I know that was super dry, and my point in including all this regulatory mumbo jumbo and showing you these graphs and charts or these tables on the different timelines and all the rules that are wrapped up into these pharmaceuticals is to not to put you asleep, although I'm sure I have. It is to make you aware of the complexities that are currently in the pharmaceutical system and the FDA and getting things approved. So I tried to go over several facets of the pharmaceutical industry today. We went through PBMs, we went through cost increases, we went through the patent process, we went through the FDA regulation and all the different timelines that can be used in different types of pharmaceutical companies. We just scratched the surface on that. And so hopefully this has given you a clearer overview of the industry as a whole. Of course, there's a lot more to look at, and certainly always keep my eye open for new articles and new ways of educating myself and others in these areas. Thank you for hanging out until the end, and we'll see you next time.